Esperanza Square was a tiny plaza tucked between old streets lined with maple trees, where time seemed to flow slower than in the outside world. Every morning, the church bell echoed across town, mingling with the clattering sound of old women pushing their carts to the market. Here, people still called each other by name, stopped to chat over the fence, and still believed in simple things like a promise or a handshake. Chuck Norris, at 70, had retreated to this town with Linda, his lifelong companion, after decades of roaming the world. Chuck of the past was a legendary name, action star, martial artist, icon of an era. But the Chuck of today was just an old man, hunched over his worn wooden shoemaking bench, his rough hands carefully stitching and gluing soles for the townspeople. Linda, 68, her silver hair tied neatly at the back, ran a small knitting shop next door, where she personally made scarves, cloaks, and wool hats for the town's children. They no longer needed fame, no longer needed the spotlight. Just mornings sipping tea together, afternoons watching the sunsets spill over the square, and evenings listening to classical music on an old radio. But that peaceful life soon began to stir with strange ripples. That evening, under a dark purple autumn sky, with clouds drifting like grey silk scarves, Chuck was closing his shop when young Miguel, 11 years old, their next-door neighbor, came sprinting home. Miguel's face was smudged, his wide eyes filled with terror. His worn canvas shoes pounded loudly on the pavement, making Chuck turn his head. "Miguel, what's wrong, son?" Chuck called out in his warm, deep voice. But Miguel didn't stop. The boy darted into his tiny house, slamming the door shut with a clatter of bolts that stabbed at Chuck's heart. Chuck stood still, hands still gripping the shop key, a ripple stirring in his chest. Linda emerged from the knitting shop, gently resting a hand on his shoulder. "Probably just kids fooling around," she whispered, though her voice couldn't hide the worry. Chuck said nothing, his eyes fixed on that small house where faint yellow light seeped through the crack in the window. Inside, a quiet, old instinct smoldered awake, the kind a man gains after witnessing life's storms. That night Linda went to bed early, but Chuck remained on the porch. He made himself a cup of hot cocoa, listening to the crickets in the garden. The wind rustled the maple leaves, carrying the scent of damp earth and fallen foliage. Esperanza Square lay silent under the dim streetlights, casting shadows over tiny flower beds. Near midnight, Chuck faintly heard voices. He squinted toward the Golden Horn bar down the street. Neon red and green lights flickered against the dew-wet pavement like shimmering blades. 3 men stood outside, smoking, speaking in harsh tones, occasionally letting out low chuckles. Out stepped a large man with slicked back hair and a shiny black suit. Johnny Russo. Chuck knew of him, at least by reputation, a new bar owner with shady roots who'd bought the corner lot a few months ago. Since then, the town had been awash in whispers. Chuck sipped his cocoa, his deep eyes observing. He saw Miguel hiding nervously behind a power pole, staring at Johnny with wide, fearful eyes. Johnny hadn't noticed the boy, but Chuck saw it all. In that moment, a long-buried feeling stirred in Chuck's heart. The feeling of a man who has seen injustice laid bare, and silently asks himself, if not me, then who? The next morning, Chuck rose early to open the shop. He saw Linda wrapping scarves for charity, her face as gentle as ever, but her glance held quiet understanding. Linda was the only one who had seen both sides of Chuck's life, the spotlight and the shadow. She knew that once Chuck decided something, nothing could stop him. "Be careful, Chuck," Linda murmured, placing a hand on his arm. "Remember why we left everything to come here." Chuck smiled softly and kissed her forehead. "I'm just going to take a look, Linda." By day, the Golden Horn bar looked like a hibernating beast. Curtains drawn, sign dark, flaking paint barely revealing the old Golden Horn emblem. Chuck pushed the door open. Inside, the air smelled of stale liquor, rotting wood and cigarettes. Johnny sat at the bar, swirling whiskey in his glass. When he saw Chuck, he lifted his head with a smirk. "Ah, Mr. Norris," Johnny drawled, emphasizing every syllable. "The living legend of Hollywood, now a cobbler, looking for a role in one of my productions." Chuck calmly sat opposite him. "I just wanted to ask," Chuck grumbled, "what's going on with Miguel and his mother?" Johnny burst into a coarse laugh. "Oh, little Miguel. His mum owes me a few grand. Just business, you know. Everyone's got debts to pay." Chuck quietly clenched his fist under the table. Johnny leaned in, eyes flashing with challenge. "Old man, let me teach you something. This isn't some cowboy movie. This is real life. And I make the rules here." Chuck stood, eyes locked on Johnny's. "You're wrong," he said quietly. "There are rules everywhere. The only question is, who has the guts to uphold them?" On his way home, Chuck passed Rose's Bakery, Frank's General Store, and Ellie and Sam's Cafe. Everyone smiled as they greeted him, but the smiles carried a trace of worry, a shadow of unease. Chuck could sense it clearly, a quiet undercurrent churning beneath the town's peaceful surface. When he got home, Linda was waiting on the porch. She saw the heaviness in his steps and sighed softly without a word. Chuck sat beside her, his calloused hands gently wrapping around her delicate ones. "Linda, I can't just stand by," Chuck murmured. Linda rested her head on his shoulder, eyes gazing far toward the square where the evening light shimmered like scattered gold. "I know," she whispered. "I just hope we don't lose anything more this time." That night, Chuck sat at his workbench, facing Miguel's battered old canvas shoes. He wiped away the dirt, stitched the small tears, mending, in a way, the fragile faith of an 11-year-old boy. Outside, the wind rustled through the maple trees, and fallen leaves danced softly on the porch roof, tapping like whispers from the past. Chuck lifted his eyes to the wall where photos hung. Him and Linda on their wedding day, behind the scenes on old movie sets, in uniform as a young soldier, face hardened beneath a steel helmet. Memories rushed in like a wave. Times he had stood at the edge of life and death, battles not just on the battlefield, but inside his own soul. Now, a new battle was beginning. Not in the ring, not on the silver screen, but right here on the quiet streets of Esperanza. Chuck knew he was ready. The next morning, Chuck awoke early, not from an alarm, but from the soft sunlight slipping through the window. Linda was already up, classical music humming softly from the small radio in the kitchen, the smell of coffee filling the air. These were Chuck's favorite mornings. Simple, peaceful, without the need for grand words. He washed up, dressed in an old checkered shirt and faded jeans, and went downstairs. Linda stood by the stove, silver hair glowing in the sunlight, slicing bread with swift, practiced hands. "Good morning, Mrs. Norris," Chuck said with a smile, kissing her cheek. Linda smiled back gently, though a flicker of worry still lingered in her eyes from the night before. "Where are you headed today?" "Just walking through the square," Chuck answered, pouring coffee into a mug adorned with a pair of doves, their wedding anniversary gift. "Might stop by Ellie's cafe." Linda squeezed his arm lightly. "Promise me one thing. Be careful, Chuck." Chuck placed his hand over hers, his gaze warm. "I know, Linda. I'm just listening." Morning in Esperanza Square held a rare, delicate beauty. Bicycles coasted lazily by, bells jingling, the smell of fresh bread wafting from Rose's Bakery. The maple trees cast long shadows on the worn cobblestones. Chuck walked slowly, greeting each person. Old Frank at the store, Rosa at the bakery, young Ellie and Sam at the cafe. But beneath their smiles, Chuck sensed something had shifted. Glances averted too quickly, laughter tinged with nervousness, greetings clipped and hesitant. When Chuck entered Ellie's cafe, The young woman hurried to meet him. "Good morning, Uncle Chuck," Ellie smiled, hands trembling slightly as she wiped a coffee mug. "Are you all right, Ellie?" Chuck asked softly. Ellie bit her lip, glancing around the cafe where a few regulars sat quietly sipping coffee. Lowering her voice, she whispered, "Uncle Chuck, I'm scared. Johnny came by last night. He said if we don't pay protection money, this place is in trouble." Chuck's hand tightened into a quiet fist, anger simmering beneath his calm exterior. He said nothing, just placed a reassuring hand on Ellie's shoulder, his gaze steady. "Don't worry, Ellie. I'll do everything I can to protect everyone." Ellie's eyes brimmed with tears as she nodded. Leaving the cafe, Chuck turned down the small street toward Frank's laundry shop. Frank, a retired veteran, was fumbling with a washing machine, his face lined with worry. "Frank, how are you holding up?" Chuck began. Frank sighed deeply, pulling Chuck aside. "Johnny's been here, Chuck. He said I need to pay $500, 0 cents, a month to stay safe. I'm not young enough to fight back anymore, Chuck. I'm scared." Chuck clapped a firm hand on his friend's shoulder, eyes resolute. "Frank, you're not alone." Frank looked at Chuck, his eyes glistening. "Chuck, I saw you fight in the war, and now you're ready to fight for us again. But please, don't do anything reckless." Chuck smiled gently, a smile that carried the strength of a lifetime. "Frank, you know me. I don't act on impulse." That evening, Chuck returned home. Linda sat knitting on the porch, her eyes lighting up as she saw him. Chuck sat beside her and shared everything that had happened. Linda listened quietly, then laid her hand on his. "Chuck, you don't have to save the whole world anymore. We've weathered so many storms. I just need you here with me. I don't need you to be a hero." Chuck looked into her eyes, his own filled with warmth and sorrow. "Linda, sometimes I wonder, if I do nothing, can I still look kids like Miguel in the eye?" Lyndon leaned closer, resting her head on his shoulder. "I understand, but please remember, my heart is more fragile than you think." Chuck wrapped his arms around her and kissed her silver hair. "I promise." That night, Chuck sat on the porch in his old rocking chair, listening to the wind in the trees. Miguel appeared quietly, his worn shoes muddy. "Uncle Chuck," Miguel whispered, "I'm so scared." Chuck opened his arms, pulling the boy close. "You're not alone, Miguel." Miguel trembled against his chest. "Uncle, Mum says we have to sell the house. I don't want to leave here." Chuck held the boy tighter, eyes gazing far toward the softly glowing square. Inside, a quiet resolve was taking shape. There was no turning back. At midnight, Chuck stood before the mirror, staring deep into his own reflection. He slipped off his wedding ring, stroked it gently, then put it back on. He donned his old leather jacket, his worn boots, and drew a long breath. Linda stood behind him, softly asking, "Where are you going?" Chuck turned and took her hand. "To see an old friend. I promise, just to talk." Linda leaned forward and pressed a kiss to his cheek. "Be careful, Chuck." Chuck stepped into the streetlights casting a faint glow on the pavement. He walked toward the Golden Horn Bar, where Johnny and his gang were laughing rowdily. That night, an undercurrent began to rise beneath the town's quiet surface, and Chuck Norris, the old shoemaker, was about to become the grain of sand that would throw the wheel of power off balance. Esperanza's night wore a new face, a shimmering coat of neon light spilling from the Golden Horn Bar. Green and red beams flashed against old brick walls, reflecting on dew-damp streets, creating a scene that was both alluring and menacing. Chuck Norris stood in the shadows beneath a towering maple tree, quietly watching. He was no longer the man on movie posters, no longer the fighter once cheered by crowds. Now he was an old man with silver hair, calloused hands, and a heart that had never learned to retreat in the face of injustice. In his hand, he held an old letter. Not from Miguel, not from Linda, but from Walter, the retired sheriff. The letter read, "Only you can remind them that this town is not so easily conquered." Chuck slipped the letter into his jacket, drew a deep breath, and stepped out of the darkness. Inside the bar, the air reeked of hard liquor, sweat, and cigarettes. Johnny Russo lounged at the bar, whiskey glass in hand, his eyes flickering with idle mockery. Around him stood 4 or 5 tattooed men, their faces cold and sharp. "Well, well, if it isn't Mr. Norris," Johnny sneered as Chuck walked in. "I thought you only acted tough on screen. Didn't expect you to bring the show to real life." Chuck calmly scanned the room. Familiar faces. Ellie, Sam, old Frank. Huddled in a corner, forced here under threats of negotiation. Miguel, his mother, and a few other children peeked anxiously from the doorway. "Johnny," Chuck said, his voice low and gravelly, "this town doesn't belong to you. It belongs to the people who bake its bread, mend its shoes, and pour its coffee." Johnny laughed, a sharp bark echoing off the walls. "Old man, you sound like some cowboy hero, but this is the real world, and in the real world money buys everything." Chuck shook his head, offering a quiet, sad smile. "No, Johnny, money only buys fear." Johnny snapped his fingers. 2 thugs approached, gripping Chuck's shoulders, dragging him to the back room, a dim space lit by a single flickering neon bulb. In the back room, they shoved Chuck onto a metal chair. Johnny leaned in close, his voice a low growl. "Who do you think you are? Do you know how many contracts I hold? How many hands do I shake in this town?" Chuck raised his eyes, old but unflinching. "I know what you're afraid of," he said calmly. "You're afraid of the day they all stand together." Johnny flinched for just a split second, but then smirked, pulling out a stack of papers. Fake contracts, debt notes, property claims. Throwing them to the floor. "This is reality, old man. Your dream, it only lives in your head." Chuck glanced at the papers, then back at Johnny. "You're wrong," he murmured. "Dreams only need one person to start them." Suddenly the door burst open. Walter appeared, draped in his old sheriff's coat, flanked by 2 retired officers. In Walter's hand, a small voice recorder blinked red. Johnny went pale. "Johnny Russo," Walter's voice rumbled. "It's all been recorded. The threats, the fake contracts, and don't bother trying to erase it. It's already at City Hall." Johnny cursed, spinning toward his men. But before they could move, Chuck stood up, looked Johnny dead in the eye, and spoke 5 quiet words that froze the entire room. "The law has heard everything." For a heartbeat, the room was utterly still. 1 second, 2, 3. Johnny stepped back, eyes narrowing. His men shifted uneasily, and beyond the bar door, Ellie, Sam, Frank, Rosa, and a stream of townspeople walked in, no longer afraid. The bar fell into a hush, broken only by the crackling of an old jazz record. Johnny tried to laugh it off. "You think City Hall cares, old man?" Walter stepped forward, lifting a warrant. His voice, though worn, carried weight. "I think you can read this." Johnny stiffened. His thugs began to back away, muttering among themselves. A couple slipped out the back. At the entrance, Linda arrived, wrapping her arms tightly around Miguel, her eyes glistening as she met Chuck's gaze. Chuck walked past Johnny, resting a hand briefly on his shoulder. "You may rule for a while, son. But in the end, everyone faces themselves." Johnny roared, lunging forward. But it was too late. Walter and his men pinned him down, cuffs snapping shut with a metallic click that sounded like the end of an era. Outside, the townspeople gathered in a circle. Ellie handed Chuck a hot coffee. Frank clapped him on the shoulder. Rosa embraced Linda. Children giggled behind Miguel. Overhead, the season's first snow began to fall. soft white petals drifting down like farewell kisses to autumn. Linda joined Chuck, squeezing his hand. Chuck smiled gently, bending to kiss her forehead. "I promised I'd only talk," he whispered. Linda let out a tearful laugh. "This time I forgive you." Walter approached, gripping Chuck's hand firmly. "Thank you, my friend, our unsung hero." Chuck gazed around the square, the neon lights now just a backdrop to beaming faces. "Walter," he murmured, "you know, sometimes all it takes is a pair of old shoes to walk justice all the way home." Walter chuckled, eyes twinkling behind thick glasses. "And no one fits those shoes but you, Chuck." That night, as Chuck and Linda walked home, Miguel ran up to slip something into Chuck's hand. His worn old shoes, cleaned and stitched anew. "I want you to have these, Uncle Chuck," Miguel grinned. Chuck pulled the boy into a tight hug, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you, Miguel. You've taught me that courage doesn't wait for anyone to hand it over." In the stillness of Esperanza, peace returned. Snowflakes drifted softly. The scent of wood smoke, coffee, and warmth filled the air, wrapping the town like a blanket. And in the midst of it all, one man stood quietly, not needing applause, not needing a name, only knowing that once again he had done what was right. The next morning, Esperanza awoke to something new. The sky shone clear after the snowfall, sunlight glinting on rooftops and windows like scattered gems. Children ran across the square, stomping patterns into the snow, their laughter ringing like bells. The church bell sang over the streets. Rosa's bakery opened early, the smell of fresh bread drifting out. Ellie and Sam's cafe buzzed with cheerful voices, but more than sounds, the greatest change was in the eyes. No longer averted, but shining with trust and unity. Chuck sat on his familiar rocking chair, wearing a thick knit sweater and silver hair aglow in the sunlight. Linda brought 2 steaming mugs of cocoa, sat beside him, resting lightly against his shoulder. In that moment, 2 souls who had crossed nearly an entire lifetime together needed no words, only the rhythm of each other's breath. Miguel ran up, hugging Chuck from behind, laughter bubbling. His mother followed, eyes misty, lips trembling in quiet gratitude. Chuck placed a gentle hand on the boy's head, his gaze soft and deep. "Uncle Chuck," Miguel chattered, "I'm going to help Mum with the garden. I'm going to fix the fence, and—" Chuck smiled, cutting in softly. "You just need to be happy, Miguel. That's the greatest gift, to your mum, to this town, and to me." At the Sunday service, the priest, a frail old man with a trembling voice, spoke at length about the strength of unity, faith in goodness, and a little town where kindness never runs out. Chuck and Linda sat in the back row, hands tightly clasped. Walter, in his old polished uniform, came over, squeezing Chuck's shoulder. "I got word," Walter whispered. Dylan confessed. "He's helping dismantle the network. Johnny won't see daylight anytime soon." Chuck nodded quietly, eyes softening. "Thank you, Walter, but truth be told, you were the one who made it happen." Walter gave a brief, wry laugh, shaking his head. "No, Chuck, without you, I'd just be another old man, lost in old memories." After the service, the town spilled into the square. A small celebration unfolded. There was bread, hot soup, and acoustic music strummed by Sam. The elders gathered under the maple trees, trading old stories. Children darted around the fountain, chirping like little birds. Miguel proudly showed Chuck the new garden fence he'd built with his mother. Ellie handed Linda a freshly knitted scarf, saying, "To say thank you." Chuck looked around, his eyes glistening. He remembered every face, every small victory that had nearly been crushed by fear. He thought of Miguel's old shoes, of the ledger handed to the authorities, of Dylan bowing his head in guilt, and wondered, what makes a victory? The answer, Chuck realized, wasn't strength, strategy, or fame. It was the quiet kindness each person carried in their heart, even when no one was watching. That afternoon, as the party faded, Chuck and Linda sat on their porch, watching the sun dip behind the mountains. Golden light painted the streets, turning the town into a honey-colored painting. "Do you have any regrets?" Linda asked, her voice as soft as the breeze. Chuck sat silent for a long moment, then murmured, eyes distant, "Only one." Linda tilted her head. "What's that, Chuck?" "I didn't start sooner," he said with a faint, wistful smile. "Didn't stand up sooner. Didn't bring hope sooner." Linda squeezed his hand gently, her smile tender. "You did it right, Chuck. Right time, right way. We can't save the whole world, but we can keep one small corner of it safe." Chuck exhaled, long and slow, as if releasing the weight of years. "Thank you, Linda," he whispered, "for walking this road with me." That night, as Linda went to bed, Chuck sat alone by the fireplace. He pulled out an old notebook, the one Linda had gifted him on his 65th birthday. On the first page, in her neat handwriting, it read, "To my Chuck. So you'll never forget. The world still needs you." Chuck smiled, closing the notebook, and stood by the window. Outside, Esperanza slept beneath the stars, the streetlights casting gentle golden halos over the snow, like quiet candles keeping vigil over each home. In his heart, Chuck thought, the fight never really ends. But these peaceful moments, they're the treasure worth protecting. 1 year later, Miguel planted his first garden. Ellie opened a second cafe on the corner. Walter became an honorary advisor to the young police force. Dylan was convicted. Johnny was sent far away. And Chuck? He still sat on the porch, still mended shoes, still smiled gently at everyone passing by. But in his eyes gleamed a new light, the light of a man who had faced the storm and still held on to hope. Linda told the neighbors, "Chuck doesn't need to step into the ring anymore. He's already won the most important fight, the one to keep his heart soft." One spring morning, Miguel ran up, placing a small paper in Chuck's hand. "Uncle Chuck, I wrote this for you." Miguel beamed. Chuck unfolded it and read aloud. "Hero needs no cape, no sword or shield, just a pair of hands ready to help, and a heart that never gives up." Chuck clutched the paper to his chest, eyes moist. "You know, Miguel," he said, voice thick with emotion, "you're the reason I still believe." And out there, the dawn of hope kept rising. Every day, every moment, in every smile, every word, every warm embrace we give each other. Chuck Norris didn't just save Esperanza. He restored what everyone had nearly forgotten, the power of faith, courage, and humanity.